Hey, I'm Darshan Leslie, welcome back to Nonstop Politics. I hope I find you well. Today we need to discuss some very interesting polling that recently came out, which on the face of it provides some quite worrying news for Sir Keir Starmer. Coming up, I'll take both a micro and macro look at why Starmer's leadership may not be registering with voters so far. Plus, I'll tackle the issue of why Labour are struggling to overtake the Conservatives in general election polling. And I'll explain why I think that actually this news might not be as bad as it may seem on the surface for the Labour leader. But first, let's take a look at the polling that is in question. This was done by Ipsos Mori in late January, who surveyed just over 1,000 Britons, all aged between 18 and 75. And the central headline was this: Marcus Rashford most likely to be doing a good job at holding the government's coronavirus response to account, according to Britons. Marcus Rashford, for non-football followers like myself, is a Premier League footballer, currently in Manchester United, and is also a member of the England squad. The article reads, new polling by Ipsos Mori shows that 56% of Britons aged 18 to 75 believe Marcus Rashford is doing a good job at holding the government to account over its coronavirus response, more than any others included in the poll. Just 9% think he's doing a bad job. Piers Morgan is seen as doing well at holding the government to account by 32%, while 31% see TV and radio journalists in general as doing a good job, a fall from 40% when asked in April 2020. Now, before I even get to Starmer's role, let me outline why this is so important, and I'll come on to Piers Morgan's role on this later. Now, in case you've been living under a rock for the last year, Marcus Rashford has been campaigning to secure free school meal provision for young people who need it during school holidays. Usually free school meals are only given out during term time, but Rashford, as someone who's used free school meals in the past and has experienced food poverty firsthand, was committed to ensuring that children did not miss out on nutrition during the school holidays. Obviously, with it being a pandemic, many of the parents of those on free school meals won't be in work and so therefore won't be able to feed their children. It's literally that stark a situation at the moment. So Rashford's been on the front line in a very vocal way. He's forced several government U-turns on this issue and was even able to persuade the government to support young people during both the Christmas and summer holidays just gone, which was so vital to those families. Now you're probably thinking to yourself, okay, that's all wonderful, but why does this disadvantage Keir Starmer? Well, it's because if we look further into this poll, we find this. Around 3 in 10, 29%, believe that Keir Starmer is doing well. However, opinion is split, with a further 28% saying he's doing a bad job at holding the government to account over their response to coronavirus. Well, this news is both quite shocking, but also not very surprising, and I'll tell you why. I think what's going on here is that there is clearly a problem with how Keir Starmer is communicating what he's up to and what his beliefs are as Labour leader and as a politician more generally. There definitely seems to be, in my opinion, a disconnect between what he's doing and the perception of what he's doing in the general public, and we need to explain this on two levels: a micro level and a macro level. Let's go micro first and use the example that we're talking about. So on free school meals, Starmer on multiple occasions has done his job of providing effective opposition on this issue. Just because you didn't hear him on telly blasting about it every 10 seconds doesn't mean that he's not doing anything, right? I went back and did some research on this, and frankly, even I was quite surprised to learn that as early as March 18th of last year, that's 5 days before the first national lockdown, Starmer was on Twitter warning about the dangers of school closures and the impact the loss of free school meals would have on young people. He wrote in part, quote, "The loss of free school meals risks millions of children going hungry, and for some, this means missing their only hot meal of the day. Whatever support provided due to coronavirus must just be the start of a renewed determination to end this scandal." So before even the first lockdown, Starmer was onto this issue. He saw right away that this had the potential to become a big deal. So the question now becomes, what exactly could Starmer do about it, and what did he do about it? Back in the summer when this was a big debacle, Starmer raised the issue at PMQs, and alongside pressure from Rashford and even some of Boris Johnson's own backbenchers, this forced the government into a U-turn, so they provided free school meals over the summer holidays. The autumn, though, is where things get really interesting because Starmer was able to use a parliamentary mechanism called an Opposition Day. According to the Parliament website, Opposition Days are days allocated in the House of Commons for the discussion of subjects chosen by the opposition, non-government parties. There are 20 days allocated for this purpose per session, under Standing Order 14. Clearly Starmer had read them and understood them. There was one of these opposition days back in the summer, but the big attention-grabbing and consequential one happened in October of 2020, when the government were hesitant to provide free school meals over the Christmas break, and Starmer used one of Labour's opposition days here to debate the issue, and a motion was put forward to MPs which would have provided 1.4 million disadvantaged children in England with £15 a week food vouchers during the holidays until Easter 2021. Unfortunately for the millions of kids struggling out there, this motion was defeated by the government. But eventually though, they did do a second U-turn in early November, and now the government will be providing provision until Christmas 2021, which is really, really good. The point here though is this, right? Yes, Rashford was the more vocal and recognisable face in all of this. He's a Premier League footballer after all. But the fact of the matter is that to argue Starmer has not provided effective opposition throughout this time, especially on this issue, is just total nonsense. Right? And this isn't to bash the work of Rashford at all, because he's been a force to be reckoned with in this process, and hopefully he will continue to be a voice and have significant influence into the future. My point, though, is that just because Starmer has been perceived as being poor at holding the government to account, his actions on free school meals, as I've outlined, say otherwise. So now let's widen this out to look at the context of where we are at as a country, and why this may be impacting voters' perception of Starmer as a leader. Well, firstly and most importantly, Starmer has been leader of the Labour Party throughout the entire pandemic, and his main raison d'etre throughout has been to provide constructive opposition. This means to support the government's legislation mandating public health measures which keep us safe and healthy, whilst also challenging the government when it gets things wrong. Now, this is where the Piers Morgan factor comes in, because it should come as no surprise to anyone that Piers Morgan has been seen as doing a better job of holding the government accountable than Starmer, 31% to 29%. He and Susanna Reid have been incredibly tough on government ministers throughout the crisis, so much so that for 201 days last year, no government ministers appeared on their programme. Absolutely crazy. The reason why this is significant, though, is that we all know Piers Morgan's style can be, let's say, confrontational, right? He is very direct, he asks questions that, to be honest, most of us at home probably want the answers to, but, you know, is incredibly combative in the way that he goes about it. Now, just imagine for a second, if Starmer went down that route of opposition where every 10 seconds he was on television tearing the Prime Minister for every single thing he's done and constantly criticising the government, you know what would happen to him, right? He'd be accused by the right-wing media of being an opportunist. He'd be accused of playing politics and not supporting the government's aim of getting this country out of a pandemic. So I think this is why Starmer's been perceived as not being a strong and opposition leader, because he's not out there every single day Boris bashing. He's probably made the calculation, which I believe to be the right one, that bashing the government every single day without backing the national effort would probably do more damage to his credibility than going down the constructive opposition route. He's doing the job in Parliament, as I outlined earlier, and that is the most important thing that he can do in my book. Two other quick things I want to mention before we skedaddle out of here. Firstly, some frustration from the left of the party that people don't really know what Starmer is about and what he stands for. As I said 2 episodes ago, 2021 needs to be the year that Keir Starmer begins to shape his vision for his leadership, right? He gave a speech last week, mainly focusing on the economic recovery after the pandemic, but not too many specifics. Notably, the word Brexit barely got a mention, which, considering the fact that there's so much chaos happening at our ports, especially by the extra red tape being slapped on our businesses, is quite a startling thing. Labour peers such as Andrew Applepie are quite rightly sounding the alarm at that, and Labour's Brexit policy is something that he will absolutely need to be working on moving forward. Starmer voted for Boris Johnson's deal, which is now looking more like a trade reduction treaty, to ensure that Labour wouldn't have to discuss Brexit anymore, but clearly it's going disastrously wrong, so he will need to find a way to walk that tightrope as soon as possible. The other critique from the left comes in the form of attacks about Labour's position in general election polling. The most recent polling from YouGov has Labour 3 points behind the Conservatives. Now, partially I think that may be because of the really sharp political divides in our country at the moment, especially in the aftermath of Brexit and the last 2 elections, moving us solidly back to a 2-party system, at least in England and Wales anyway. But the criticism of Starmer and the centre ground of the Labour Party is this: well, if he was such a good opposition leader, why is Labour not 20 points ahead in the same way that Blair was in the mid-90s before becoming Prime Minister? And that is absolutely fair criticism, and honestly, do I think Labour will win the next election? Even before the pandemic, I thought their chances were slim. So they do have an absolutely ginormous mountain to climb. But again, I'd caution you to remember that we are in a pandemic. Most people aren't like you and me who follow politics very closely. People have much more important things to worry about, like ensuring they have enough money to feed themselves and their children, rather than worrying about whether Keir Starmer is preparing a rise in the top rate of tax, for example. So perspective and context are always needed in these types of situations. So right now, Starmer should be on alert, but not too worried. Obviously, faces like Rashford and Morgan will inevitably suck quite a lot of the oxygen out of the room since they are such big figures. But in terms of Starmer's ability to provide effective opposition, I think he's doing exactly what needs to be done at this moment, and I'm confident that when the pandemic is over, voters will view the Labour leader in a completely different light. Thank you for listening to Nonstop Politics. If you enjoyed, why not follow us on Instagram @NonstopPolitics, and don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.